Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We have all of you present physically here on the fringes of the annual Mining Indaba in Cape Town. And we have many guests in the audience registered online and participating online. The recent IPCC report pointed to the really dramatic acceleration in decarbonisation that needs to happen if we're to address the impacts of climate change and to keep global temperatures to beneath 1.5 degrees Celsius. The implications for humanity of changing climate are significant and severe, as the report makes plain, and they're particularly significant, of course, for the African continent. Of interest to all of you and to me is the fact that the IPCC shows that African crop productivity has decreased to a third of what it was 60 years ago as a direct consequence of climate change. And of course, there are implications for drought, for flooding, for waterborne diseases, and the climate, as we know. And today, we're here to discuss one of the most exciting solutions to the challenge of climate change. Specifically, we're here to discuss how green hydrogen, and for those of you who are not familiar with the different forms of green hydrogen, that's hydrogen produced from renewable energy sources. How green hydrogen can accelerate our path towards zero carbon energy and provide sustainable energy security and inclusive growth, in particular for African economies. We're here to discuss the competitive advantages that African nations have, not all, but many with abundant natural resources, with access to minerals and metals that will be used in the catalytic process that's required to electrolyse and produce hydrogen. We've got Dr. Rebecca from the South African government. You've been on the main stage at least a couple of times, I think, this week, talking to the amazing work that you've been pursuing over very many years now in preparing the South African economy for the hydrogen economy. We've got Dr. Famida Smith, who has been the talk of the town since the launch last week of the Anglo-American hydrogen-powered vehicle. There won't be anyone in this room or online who isn't now aware of that. And we've got Jason Cuomo, who is a chemical engineer and very well versed in the process of what's required, both on the inputs and the processing side, to actually produce green hydrogen. So, Famida, if I may, let me start with you. Why should we all be so interested in this green hydrogen?
So green hydrogen is actually something that's very interesting. It's the lightest element that you would find. It's incredibly versatile, and it offers various options when it comes to energy solutions. So you can incorporate it within transportation, you can incorporate it within stationary or grid-related power solutions, you can incorporate it within backup power solutions. So it's incredibly versatile. In addition to that, it also helps to decarbonize really hard-to-abate sectors, like, for example, steel. The introduction of hydrogen in the steel-making process allows it to become green steel. In addition to that, you can create carbon-neutral feedstocks from it. So, for example, green ammonia, green methanol. So it's really, really exciting because it really helps the world and it provides one of the solutions for the world to actually achieve decarbonisation goals.
I wonder if you're both surprised about the excitement that's been generated this week around green hydrogen.
So the truck launched last week. I think it's expected. It's the world's first largest green mine haul solution. So I have to say I'm not really too surprised that it's Anglo, and that is not just me. It's Anglo employees have been getting a lot of queries around it because it's a very exciting demonstration. You know, it showcases that hydrogen is here, it's now, it's a tangible vehicle that's right in front of you. You can see it, you can touch it, you can feel it. And it's really taking that step forward to show us that with effort, we can get this off the ground.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that project? How long were you invested in the development of this technology? And what are your plans going forward, and this haulage truck specifically?
So with regard to our new gen project, which is our zero haulage emission solution, The project was led by our Julian Souls and his team. The discussion started in 2019. So from 2019 till a launch in 2020, that is an enormous feat to be able to deliver on a project of that nature. It was done in conjunction with our partners, Angie, who were responsible for the production of the green hydrogen and the hydrogen refueling infrastructure on site. And our team, Anglo-American, was really responsible for the development around the truck. The truck is a hybrid, so it incorporates an 800 kilowatt fuel cell system together with a 1.2 megawatt battery. So it's a total power potential or generating potential of 2 megawatts that is on board that particular vehicle. The plan is to generate green hydrogen on site. The solar panel installation is in progress. Put that through together with water in an electrolyzer, generate our own green hydrogen. The hydrogen will be compressed and stored on site. And then via a refueling station, we would be able to then fuel the vehicle. This is the first prototype. We have 40 of these vehicles at Mogalakwena. The aim is around 2026, 2027 to roll that out to the 40. By 2030 is to start rolling that out across 7 of our other open pit mining operations. We have just over 400 of these vehicles across our mining operations. And to give you an idea of what this equates to, once we have hydrogen operating in all of these 400 vehicles, so that's just 400, it takes, in current terms, with regard to CO2 abatement, it abates 500,000 worth of CO2 that's related to diesel vehicles on the road at this particular time.
Impressive.
Yeah.
Rebecca, I'd like to turn to you, if we may. You are Chief Director for Hydrogen and Energy at the Department of Science and Innovation in the South African government. I wonder if you could tell us about the South African government plans for developing the hydrogen economy in South Africa, and specifically that roadmap.
Well, I think the process that we followed was really around understanding who are the different players in the system that needed to be involved in the process, what their roles were, and really come together around alignment around what was success. And then I think when success, you look at the government priorities around the triple challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, it was important that this opportunity, if we were to take it, those issues would be addressed at the same time. And really, the conversations that we had close to, I would say, 60 stakeholder organizations involved. We had an industrial reference group with private sector, we had academia, science councils, and then we also had civil society and government departments involved who we expected to be either in charge of outcomes or first movers in terms of the work we're doing. And really, what came out of this process, it was extensive stakeholders with stakeholder engagement process with, one-on-one interviews. We had expert working groups as well as surveys. And really what came together was these are the key actions we need to take. And so we broke it down into the different outcomes. And what Femida's mentioned that hydrogen is a very flexible element. The important thing is you can do a lot, but you can't do everything. And really what was for us is like over the next 24 to 36 months, what must we do as government to create or build the trust between government and private sector around this opportunity, but also to ensure that we are preparing long term. We've been doing some studies around jobs. And if we were to move, a recent study that was finalized a few weeks ago was that if we move towards green hydrogen in South Africa, by 2050, there's just above 3 million jobs to the economy. Some are retained and some created new across different sectors.
Could you repeat that?
Just 3 million.
3 million jobs.
Up to 2050, of course.
Up to 2050.
But the question for government is how do we start training and put in place the training backbone around ensuring it can happen? But then also, one of the, I guess, biggest claims of fame before the Hydrogen Society Roadmap was the National Hydrogen RDI Strategy, or we call HISA program. And really, we're not going to fully benefit from the penetration of hydrogen fuel cells, be it trucks, be it stationary, into this country unless we have a strong innovation program. So we're looking to extend that program for another additional 10 years. So it was approved by Cabinet last year in September. That we have 10 more years of support. That's great. But I think for us, it's as the South African government, how do we partner with private sector around this innovation work? We're very proud of Anglo. You know, I'm a member of the International Science and Innovation, DSI and South Africa were a member of the International Partnership for the Uptake for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in the Economy. And you're so used to like listening to the different presentations from other countries, but now we're so proud to say we're South African, we have this haulage truck. So what FEMA says in basically 2 to 3 years under COVID, they made this happen, all right? And what it means for us is that hydrogen is here, it's now, but the partnership between us and government and Anglo is really ensuring that they have the required funding so they can not necessarily have challenges because they were first movers. So how do we enable them to innovate more? How do we enable them to move from 0 to 40 as quickly as possible? But then also for other mining sector companies who should also take this journey, how do we enable them to also have the same, magic as Anglo around the hydrogen economy? So I think our job as a DSI is, like I said, we're in the game earlier than everyone else. However, we're playing, I think, an honest brokering role between government, private sector, academia, to ensure that we have a clear plan of action and we stick to that and keep to the commitments around that.
Jason, you're a chemical engineer. You've been invested for a decade now, I think, in trying to develop and improve the electrolysis process, which is so critical to converting water into hydrogen. Tell us about your journey and whether you're as optimistic about the sort of scale of ambition being realized in the way that Rebecca has stated, based on your knowledge of the technologies, the electrolysis technologies that exist, and the ability to scale those relatively quickly.
100%. So thank you, Marcus. So if you just look at my role at Hydrox Holdings, we develop both conventional electrolyzers and we develop novel type electrolyzers. So our goal is to make electrolyzers better suited to run off renewable energy loads. So if you look at the characteristics of those, they are intermittent and they are irregular. So unfortunately, if you're running off a pure PV panel or solar plant, or if you even have capacity to add wind to that, your capacity factors are fairly low. And when I speak about capacity factors, what I mean is the time the electrolyzer is actually running at full load producing hydrogen. So if you look at electrolyzers as they're currently situated, you get your PEM electrolyzers, which operate in an acidic environment, and then you get your liquid alkaline electrolyzers, which are the alkaline environment. Now, the alkaline electrolyzers are very robust, they're cost effective, and they last a fairly long time. So what that means is the economics to produce hydrogen is looking fairly positive, going with the liquid alkaline electrolyzers, however, trying to couple them to renewable energy sources and being able to handle that intermittent loads. So one of our main focuses is trying to get the liquid alkaline electrolyzers to adopt these intermittent loads a bit better. We've taken two approaches on that. So Hydrox Holdings builds a zero-gap electrolyzer, and if I get into the technicalities, what that means is we have electrodes and an assembly which supports the membrane component. The membrane component is a very important component because it keeps the hydrogen and oxygen gases separated. So it keeps the electrolyzer operating in a safe manner. So we have a zero-gap electrolyzer, and what that means is the membrane is continuously supported out its operation. So during intermittent loads, as the power conditions fluctuate and are fed to the electrolyzer, that membrane is supported, it doesn't move, it doesn't degrade over time because of the fluctuating nature of the gas production, and what that means is we have longer lifespans of the electrolyzer itself. Second of all, what we've done is we've produced an electrolyzer which doesn't use a membrane. It operates on a flow principle, but it's effectively trying to move the component that degrades the most in the cell. And then second to that, allow it to operate off renewable energy loads a lot better. And I think this is the shift that we need to make. Obviously, there's no point in producing hydrogen off the grid, although the economics are better suited to having the electrolyzer running 24/7. It needs to be clean, it needs to be green, and we need to allow it to enable renewable energy, otherwise we're not achieving much. In terms of scalability, there are a number of projects that are looking to be deployed in the gigawatt capacity. This is great to see, and even at Anglo, I believe there's a 3.5 megawatt electrolyzer that has been installed, or two banks that add up to that. It is a large plant, and it is servicing the 800 kilowatt fuel cell, which is installed in the truck, so that is great to see. But there are projects like in Namibia, for example, they're looking to extend electrolyzer capacity to about 2 gigawatts, 3 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity. If you look at the current modules, they've built up in a maximum of about 3 megawatts. So essentially, you're looking at about 300 electrolyzers being installed in those processing plants looking to produce clean fuels. There is this natural progression to scale, and I think the equipment, as it stands, allows for that scaling. It is built in modular banks, but that is not a problem. It allows for servicing these systems fairly easily. One can go down while the rest operate. And then second to that, if you have them modularized in banks, it's easier to operate a single unit and have control over it as opposed to a larger system. So in a nutshell, as I say, it's great to see pretty much one of the largest implementations being running off the truck. It is an incredible advancement, and I'm pretty sure that prototype is going to yield good results, and I would like to see it scaled further beyond just the use of industrial vehicles like in the mining sector, but potentially getting to the point that we are running long-haul transportation vehicles such as your trucks along the major networks.
What's required to get the economics right?
So you have to look at the applications. I think there's a lot of discussion over the production costs. So it is cheaper to produce hydrogen from your fossil fuel methods. But the production cost is not the only cost that is approached to the end user. There's a whole lot of different stages in that logistics cycle that need to be taken into account in the cost model. So if you're looking at producing hydrogen from the standard from methane gas and putting it through the steam reforming process, and if you have carbon capture coupled with that, you're looking at producing hydrogen at about $2 per kilogram. But that is at a centralized source, and that is at a purity of technical grade hydrogen. So that won't be running your fuel cells. So there's a couple of different processes you need to add to that. So the first is purification to get it to a point that it can operate in a fuel cell. And second to that, you need to then compress it and the logistics and the transportation. If you look at those stages, that can add about $3 to $4 to $5 per kilogram of hydrogen to get it to your end user. Whereas electrolyzers, they are decentralized. They can be installed at the customer site, at the end user, supplying either the processing plant or the refueling station. So pretty much just the production cost and some compression is what the costing model of the electrolyzer looks like. So I don't think it's the case that, unfortunately, or fortunately for us, that the fossil fuel methods are lower in the actual cost to the end user. And that's just producing hydrogen. If you look at supplementing or exchanging diesel, for example, going to the fuel cell method like Anglo's done, there are cost models that show that it is cost comparative to run a diesel truck as it is to run a fuel cell electric vehicle. And the reasons for that is, as I say, you don't have to take into account the transportation costs. It's decentralized, producing on site. And second to that, the efficiency of the fuel cell that is in these trucks is much higher than an internal combustion engine.
They store more energy, is that?
Say again?
They store more energy than the fossil fuel.
No, they utilize the hydrogen more effectively. So essentially, per kilogram of hydrogen, you get more fuel output, well, more energy output. So if you look at an internal combustion engine, you're looking at efficiencies of like the 30-40% point. The fuel cells that can be operated in these trucks are looking at about a 60% efficiency point. So that's taking the energy that is available from hydrogen or the diesel in the internal combustion cycle, and actually how much energy you can retrieve from that fuel source.
Rebecca, I warned you that I was going to turn to you to talk us through some of the pilot projects and clusters within the Hydrogen Society roadmap. So I wonder if you could just comment about the acknowledgement and the impetus from our policymakers around the need to address some of the remaining sort of bottlenecks or constraints in the regulatory framework.
We talk about innovation and technological innovation, but sometimes you may have a technology which is, at parity with the incumbent, and really what you need is systems innovation and policy innovation. Systems innovation around issues around scaling up of hydrogen, like the hydrogen valleys, which are geographical areas where you're trying to scale up hydrogen consumption, is talking systems innovation, looking at aggregating demand, creating partnerships to make it happen. And then policy innovation is saying you may have an existing policy or an act that needs a regulation to be revised. And, regulations we know don't have to go all the way back to Parliament for revision. It's a ministerial, the minister gazettes a regulation. So I think this thing, what he mentioned around systematically unpacking what the barriers are and then systematically working through them, line by line, policy by policy, regulation by regulation, is really what's necessary. And for us, the Hydrogen Society Roadmap was just a starting point to say, okay, this is what needs to be done. And it's also almost like a to-do list that private sector, public sector, academic can actually hold government to account because it's written and it's published. So I think we're well intentioned, and then I think the policy innovation could be, what are those actions that can be taken? So can we look at the 100 megawatts for renewables that you have for the mining sector, as well as for municipalities which are in good standing? Can that be modified slightly to maybe add hydrogen consumption or use on site? Or, sometimes you can wheel and deal under certain circumstances. The Bio-to-Watt project that we have in Pretoria is such a project where you produced biogas and then you're producing electricity and selling it. So those types of projects I think are required in order to figure out the fastest way.
But you're also looking at green hydrogen as an export opportunity, aren't you? And I'd like to understand the context there, where we see the demand coming from, and the competitive advantage that South African, in this case, green hydrogen, would have in a global market.
Well, in terms of South Africa's competitive advantage, sunshine, wind, and I think through the Renewable Energy IPP program, we've shown that we can build large-scale solar and wind facilities, or for power generation. Second to that, our port facilities, which are existing. We have numerous ports. 3 sides of the country are bordered by the ocean, so you have numerous ports that are ready to be able to, export hydrogen. You have Kucha, you have the Bugabai. Currently, I think in the early stages, a dolphin-type system will be used until the full port is built. You also have the Durban port as well, and Saldanha port. In addition to that, we have world-class innovation in our private sector. So, let's not forget that Sasol has the largest point source of CO2 in the world because of Fischer-Tropsch. But also we have other world-class excellence, which you saw this past weekend at Anglo around the transition. In addition to that, I think we have really strong policy and planning. So if you look at the Economic Reconstruction Recovery Plan, it's very clear from presidency what are the 3 pillars of decarbonization and building back better. One is green hydrogen, the second is around electric vehicles, and the third, which is moving towards a low carbon economy, is looking at our coal-fired power fleet and understanding the transition there, as well as decarbonization of Eskom. And then I think last but not least, what we spent a lot of time trying to make the case for how is the transition going to be inclusive. So I think we also have great partnerships with international partners around skilling up, reskilling that need to be brought to bear so that we can actually reskill the youth of this country to become green artisans and technicians of the future. And I think those partnerships will be key to exporting green hydrogen, but also at the same time ensuring that as we get into, as we move towards this hydrogen economy, we can partner on skills and innovation for the scale up.
I'd like to bring you in after Famida, Jason, to talk about skills and whether those skills are available in the marketplace. You're in the business of manufacturing electrolyzers. I think it'd be really interesting to understand not just the skills, but those aspects, inputs that are required to actually manufacture electrolyzers. Could you give us a perspective on how different African nations are approaching this opportunity?
So I think before I address that, I should just highlight what the African Hydrogen Partnership is for those who don't know. So it's a trade association, and it's really focused on bringing the various countries within Africa together, uniting the continent around a green energy or green hydrogen ambition. So the African Hydrogen Partnership basically looks at everything from production, compression, use through fuel cells, as well as export of green hydrogen to the rest of the world from Africa. And it's really trying to bring the African continent together and trying to really create pathways for Africa to participate and supply green hydrogen into the rest of the world. So there are a number of countries that have got ambitious or ambitions around green hydrogen. Firstly, South Africa. I think we should just highlight our ambition as a country, as well as the great job that was done by the Department of Science and Innovation around the Hydrogen Society roadmap. We understand that Namibia, Angola, there is Morocco, as well as the United Arab Emirates, that have all shown ambitions towards producing green hydrogen and supplying green hydrogen to the rest of the world. There's several engagements between the African Hydrogen Partnership and Europe, for example, around how do we leverage African green hydrogen into what Europe needs. So we understand that within Europe, the availability of land is scarce. Solar energy is not as great as we have within the African continent. And how do we now leverage our natural resources to be able to capture this market and play a key role within the larger economy?
Are you seeing a keen interest there from other participating countries, or you wouldn't be able to tell us? No.
Yeah, so I think there's definitely a lot of interest, and I think it's just for the nations to come together and to be able to position themselves correctly at that platform, right? And it's a great platform to be able to showcase what we as Africa can do. But then also I think it's an opportunity for other countries who don't really understand what we have to offer to engage with us and to be able to understand the value proposition that we're putting forward as well.
And as we consider that value proposition, is there consideration being given already to integrating value chains across countries?
I think those are still early days that are under development, but it's definitely something that is under discussion, particularly through the AHP. And how do you bring the various countries together to be able to collaborate? And I think that is the key term. Rebecca alluded to that earlier, partnerships. How do we work together? How do we collaborate? Because as individuals, as individual organizations, as individual countries, we are going to struggle to meet the global decarbonization goals unless we work together.
I wanted to see to what extent South Africa's plans involve engagement with the rest of the continent at this stage, or whether there's just so much priority on developing a national.
I think from a South African point of view, I think we've always worked well with other countries in Africa, with African Union, and even SADC. If you just talking about issues of integration, one of the biggest inputs into hydrogen is water. We're a water scarce country, but if you go, to across the border at Lesotho, they have quite a bit of water in comparison to us, even though we are talking about desalination. But then also, if you talk about in the energy sector in general, South African power pool. So we've already been partnering on issues of electricity generation and for security of supply. Hydrogen seems like a very natural, extension of that, especially since it's going to be, coupled well with the power sector. But also, I think from a training point of view and skills development, in terms of having trying to scale up training quickly for Namibia and other countries which are pursuing this. I think that should be the partnership. But then last but not least, this issue around harmonization of standards. As a member of the IPHE, it's 22 countries, UAE just joined recently, and the European Union. A lot of countries are really struggling with how do you have the proper regulations in place. And I think working together, there's different working groups that are allowing countries to come with their challenges and sitting down together with other countries to figure out how they're solving it themselves. I think there's a lot of value in working together around those similar issues.
Jason, I wanted you to give some perspective on value chains and skills. Can you share with us your?
Perfect. I think this is a really good point. So, if we just look at our developments, for example, we try to keep most of the manufacturing process and material selection and purchases from local suppliers. But if not, all the key components are imported. And when I say key components, this is some of the housing material of the electrolyzers, key instrumentation that is built and is well suited to operating in the environment of hydrogen and the corrosive liquids that they are exposed to. And then secondly, it is the membranes, the catalytic coatings, or the electrode. They are all unfortunately imported. All the auxiliary systems, if you look at the fuel cells, a lot of the PEM electrolyzers, and then the dispensing systems are also imported. And I think if we are going to scale, and we're going to scale fairly rapidly, and we are looking at deploying in the gigawatt scale, I think we need to focus more on education and skills development in the manufacturing and building of these systems, as opposed to just in servicing and the technicians to service and maintain that value chain. So, for example, I like speaking about Namibia and their plans because it is a large deployment there. If you're looking at a gigawatt or 2 gigawatt installation there, and you put an estimation of the electrolyzer capital expenditure at about $1,000 per kilowatt installed, at a 2 gigawatt capacity, you're looking at a $2 billion cost for those electrolyzers, and they will be imported as it stands. So I think there should be focus on, as I say, not only upscaling and servicing those value chains, it's doing the work that HISA is doing. But I think it needs to be expedited. There needs to be competition in the field, and it needs to be pushed. As I say, if we're going to spend that kind of funds on the deployment of this technology, it should be from local companies. It will maximize job creation and have the greatest impact on the economy and the social economics that follow through from that.
What's the opportunity for the mining sector specifically?
So there's really 3 avenues that we see when it comes to hydrogen. The first one is obviously decarbonising our own operations, and I mean, I spoke to that, as well as our new gen diesel displacement. The hydrogen truck is a key component for that. The second one is around market development. So our platinum group metals are found all through the hydrogen value chain, from production to storage to end use. I was asked a question today: how does platinum come into energy storage? And I had to take the discussion, or the media room that asked me that, through liquid organic hydrogen carriers. So as you adhere the hydrogen to the LOHC, or you dissipate the hydrogen, that process needs a catalyst that uses our platinum group metals. So that's where it's incorporated, and I thought it's just important to highlight, just in case someone here has exactly the same question. So from a market development perspective, we've always taken an ecosystem approach. So we go into the market, we identify an opportunity area where hydrogen is one of the key opportunity areas we see for our metals, and we really look at how do we shape businesses, and then how do we shape the environment around those businesses. The way we shape businesses is we look at assembling new ventures. How do you invest in R&D, what we call venture-led research, develop these ventures. Then you scale up. How do you get growth capital? And that's really through our investment in AP Ventures and giving these ventures additional opportunity and additional funding to be able to grow in size. And then, very important, commercial collaboration, like the work that we've been doing with the DSI around the Hydrogen Valley and the Hydrogen Freight Corridor work that we've been doing with NG and Bambili Energy. The way we shape the environment in which these businesses operate is around policies. We advocate for enabling policy frameworks, and we do this really on a global scale. And second to that is communicating around what it is that we're doing. So around the technology, what it can achieve. So communicating the right message at the right time and transparently. So it's really, that's how we shape the market around it. And the third area is really around us as an organization supporting the just energy transition. So once again, that talks to the work that we're doing outside of the mine gate, like the Hydrogen Valley work that we've been doing. Through the Hydrogen Valley report, we understand that the valley, which extends 835 kilometers between Limpopo, Gauteng, and KwaZulu-Natal, has potential to generate $4 billion in GDP for the country, 900 million in taxes, and a minimum job creation of 14,000 jobs per annum by 2050. So it's really how we are now creating this opportunity for others to participate, but also ourselves in promoting a just transition within the South African context.
Those figures you just referenced, they're in relation to the Hydrogen Valley corridor.
Just to the Hydrogen Valley. It's not Anglo-American specific figures. It's really how others participate within the valley and how we all work together to be able to achieve that.
I know that this panel is familiar with what the Hydrogen Valley is, but for those in the audience who aren't, could you just give us a quick summary?
Sure. So the Hydrogen Valley is a geographic region that extends 835 kilometers between Limpopo, Gauteng, and KwaZulu-Natal. It looks at the creation of 3 green hydrogen hubs, and really looks at the co-location of the production of green hydrogen with the end use. As Rebecca indicated, what makes valleys sustainable is aggregation of demand. So as you generate the green hydrogen, you need to make sure that you have sustainable demand at the end of the day. The demand is not fixed to one particular application for green hydrogen. It's really multiple applications. So it revolves around transport, hydrogen that can be used within stationary applications like buildings. How can hydrogen be used as backup power? How can hydrogen be used as a clean fuel or clean chemical? So how do we incorporate it, for example, within the generation of green ammonia? And that's really that concentration within that particular area of how we get generation and demand. And within that region, obviously, with the generation and demand, we're then creating jobs.
Thank you, Famida. I'm going to turn to our audience now, if I may. Forgive me, I haven't put you on notice that that's what I'm going to do, but I hope there'll be some questions either from participants who are joining us online, both from within the continent and outside the continent, but also from those of you in the room who've been privileged enough to hear from these protagonists in the development of the hydrogen economy. Are there any questions from the floor at this stage?
I'm Tim Ball. I'm partner at Webber Wentzel in intellectual property, and I'm quite interested in the intellectual property landscape that is relevant to this area. You know, to what extent are technologies proprietary or open and protected across different jurisdictions across Africa?
So looking at electrolyzers themselves, they have been around for hundreds of years. They've been servicing the chloroalkaline environment for, I think, standing over 120 years as it stands. A lot of these designs have moved over then to produce hydrogen with much similar designs. I think the core process being the separation of the hydrogen and oxygen being produced on different cells separated by a membrane. There's not much protection as it stands around those. There's just certain characteristics on how you put that electrode assembly together that is protected. New innovations in the field, such as our own innovation being the membraneless electrolyzer, there are key components that can be protected there. And then I do know of 2 or 3 projects which kind of reshape how electrolysis is done, either separating the oxygen and hydrogen produced at different stages, or they take a totally different approach in the separation process, so not using membranes. Their key operating methods are patented, but I think the conventional, well-standing approach to electrolysis, which is currently being implemented on a large scale, there's not a whole well-rounded protection on that operating procedure. It's key components on the electrolyzer stacks that are protected.
Thanks, Michael Solomon, the University of Cape Town. Benchmark, I know that there's quite a lot of debate around the cost per kilogram of hydrogen as to where we are right now and where we need to get parity with other forms of fuel like diesel. And I'd really like to get some sort of benchmark on that. And then also, Jason, you mentioned the capital cost per gigawatt in terms of the electrolyzers. What is a sort of rule of thumb benchmark there?
Yeah, no, so perfect. So let me start with the operating point. So currently, so let me start actually with what is an electrolyzer. It's a dynamic piece of equipment that you can change the voltage, and essentially what the voltage is changing is it either allows you to produce more hydrogen from a centimeter or per volumetric area of the electrolyzer, or you can go to the other end and reduce the voltage, which means that you're producing hydrogen more efficiently, but you need a larger electrolyzer to produce that, which then affects your capital expenditure. So when we state values on the cost of the hydrogen, it always has to be tied, well, cost in production needs to be tied to a capital point, otherwise it's not actually telling you much about the design. So if you look at systems that are being deployed, and our system as well, we are achieving about 55 kilowatt hours per kilogram of hydrogen. And that is at a benchmark, capital benchmark of about $1,300 to $1,500 per kilowatt installed. So that's 1.3 million to 1.5 million for a megawatt electrolyzer. Dollars, yes, that is dollars. But when you're looking at it, it's a dynamic problem. If your power feed is coming in at a cheaper cost, what you can then do is sacrifice efficiency. And if you're sacrificing efficiency, you can build smaller units to operate at the low efficiency and achieving a lower capex point. So whenever we do our studies or our design around these systems, that feed cost that is being inputted into the model is fairly important and we design around it. If you look at the current cost to produce hydrogen from electrolysis, about 60 to 80% is the electrical feed at the moment, depending on what the cost is. But as you move down the ranks and you start approaching the 40 cents, 50 cents per kilowatt hour, the actual capital expenditure that starts to contribute about 40 to 50% of the total cost to produce electrolytic hydrogen. So I think the main thing for us is what we would like to do is not only reduce the capital expenditure, but what we need to focus on is obviously getting to these points that we're using these low-cost power sources, and these low-cost power sources are from renewable energy. But then we have to be mindful of the capacity factor. If you have a capacity factor of 50%, what you're effectively doing then is over a 20-year lifespan, the hydrogen that you could produce over that lifespan is cut in half. And that effectively doubles in your capital expenditure towards the total cost of hydrogen production.
Kay Walsh from Nova Economics. So in terms of stimulating demand, are there any export markets, particularly developed countries who are trying to decarbonise, that are offering incentives for the large-scale procurement of hydrogen products like green ammonia? I suppose products that can ship relatively easily in Germany.
Yeah, I'm willing to answer that. I mean, there's a number of countries that have hydrogen strategies that do speak about the importation of green hydrogen, green ammonia as part of their hydrogen strategy. I think most notable, Germany, of course, has been very active both across the world as well as in South Africa, looking at the importation of green hydrogen from South Africa. Also Japan. I know they have an existing project with Australia that was, I think, successfully had the importation of hydrogen from Australia, but they're also looking in South Africa and I think Africa. And then also I think Europe in general is looking at the opportunities. Like I said, there's issues of land availability when it comes to the large-scale deployment of renewables. So I think globally, there's quite a few countries looking at the importation.
I think if I can just add to that, the Germans' KfW grant funding opportunity, that's really around green hydrogen projects. So it's not only the supply of green hydrogen, but also large-scale adoption of green hydrogen.
We've got a question online.
What can African governments do for starting commercially feasible green ammonia and fertilizer projects for the African agricultural sector?
When you look at hydrogen, so hydrogen is the building block of many of your hydrocarbon sources and many of your fuels. One of them, and it's not a hydrocarbon, but it's ammonia. And you can effectively produce ammonia if you're just extracting nitrogen from the air, compressing it, storing it, purifying it, and reacting it with electrolytic hydrogen. And if it's produced on green, so using renewable energy, then you can effectively carry out the Haber-Bosch process and you can produce ammonia. Ammonia, of course, is used as a feedstock in the fertilizer production. South Africa is a net importer of ammonia. So there is a great benefit in potentially looking at producing ammonia ourselves, putting that production in the hands of the companies that either require it, and decoupling those producers from the insecurities and inefficiencies of the global market and importing these. I think if we had to target a point where we can actually produce ammonia at a cost that is cheaper than actually importing it, what we actually need to do is take these electrolyzers and place them by the end users. So if you're looking at the Horn of Africa in particular, there's abundant renewable energy there. Set up solar panels, set up these wind turbines, and effectively produce hydrogen from these renewable energy sources at the low cost. Produce hydrogen at the end user, utilize the nitrogen and produce the green ammonia closer to the end user. So the focus there is just, again, reducing the power cost that is fed to the electrolyzer, and then getting that electrolyzer, which is decentralized, close as you can to the end user. That is the best way to minimize the costs associated with that production process.
We're all aware of the shortage of fertilizer supply globally as a consequence of the war in Ukraine at the present in particular, and the shortage of the feedstock for production of fertilizer. So there's a solution in the offing in which African nations with access to hydrogen electrolysis technology could be producing the fertilizer.
You can do it now. The technology definitely exists. The problem always is cost.
Yeah.
Although we do want to be green, we still need to be mindful of costs. And if the green ammonia does come at a cost, who suffers that brunt and the high cost? But the technology exists. The electrolyzers are well suited to provide the hydrogen to the processing plant, converting the hydrogen to ammonia. That process is in existence as well. All the technologies are well established. It's just the cost that we need to work to reduce.
Jonathan Berman from Autonomy Capital. My question is about offtake contracts and pricing. When we look at financing projects like this, obviously in the renewable energy world, offtake contracts tend to be fixed price or inflation linked, and most commodities, including traditional fertilizer markets, are volatile and are financed on the basis of a market for commodities. Given the amount of capital that will have to be invested in this sector, do panel members see long-term fixed price contracts being available for offtakes to make projects financeable, or prices still going to be more volatile?
The fixed term price contracts work well, and the take-off agreements work well with supplying electricity from renewable energy sources, mainly because you supply the equipment, you finance the equipment, and then you provide the product, which is the electricity and power. The difficult thing, and this is in particular producing hydrogen from electrolysis, is that you have feed to that system which aren't fixed. Your feed power to the system isn't fixed unless you're getting it from a renewable energy source that you're in control of. Then second to that, your water as well, although the water doesn't carry a huge cost contribution to the production of electrolytic hydrogen. But it's looking at that model and try to get take-off agreements or put a price point on it while still working with those input variables which aren't really fixed. So if you look at how these systems are being deployed currently, I don't think most of them are being deployed in the means that there is a take-off agreement on the back end of it. It's pretty much selling the equipment to the end users. And I know that's probably not the question, or the answer to the question that was asked, mainly because I think they were looking at the exploitation of hydrogen and how it would do in the market. But I think that's a nice point to add from the actual production side, that it's hard to get these fixed price contracts and these take-off agreements with those variables that are irregular fed to the actual production system.
There was a question from Zianda quite earlier on, so I'm not sure if it's been addressed, but she says, question to Dr. Famida Smith, what are some of the stumbling blocks in implementing green hydrogen projects, and how do you plan on overcoming them?
So the biggest problem is around licensing and permitting requirements. The timeframes around these are incredibly long. The way we are addressing it is both our renewable energy projects as well as the Hydrogen Valley have been registered as SIP projects. The Hydrogen Valley has gone through the first 2 hurdles of approval, and we see that as a positive development that will help us to overcome this particular issue. And once your project has been registered as a SIP, it allows you an expedited licensing and permitting process. I think it's something like 51
days.
Yeah, I thought it was like 55 or 56 days, but it's under 60 days. Let's just say that to be safe. So it really, it technically reduces your permitting process by almost half.
Great. Any more questions from the audience? Nothing online? No? Great. Well, I wonder if I could turn to our panel. If there are any final concluding statements you'd like to make before I wrap up and invite us all to take a drink just next door.
So I think coming out of the discussions that I've been having at Mining Indaba, and Rebecca's probably had the same. People have always asked us, why is hydrogen really going to happen? And my answer to that is yes, it's happening now. It's here. The large mining haul truck is proof of that. It's a tangible project that really opens the mind to additional possibilities. This mining haul truck, when we started engaging OEMs, it was so huge that they were shaking their heads and like, there's no way we can get this done. There's no way this project's going to work. And we as Anglo, the team, had to step in, be really creative and innovative in terms of how we're doing things. And I think it's a true testament to the team, but also to the fact that the technology works. It's really there to decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors. It's happening. We see global investment, not just Anglo. Globally, there's great momentum towards hydrogen, and it's just highlighting how important hydrogen is within global decarbonization.
I would probably leave with the fact, hydrogen is a sunrise sector, without a doubt. Also, mining, I would say, is a sunrise sector, especially with the decarbonization options we're seeing at Anglo, but also even in terms of battery electric vehicles and mining, because also with the decarbonization or net zero, we need more minerals, and we should be mining those minerals using cleaner technologies, so that's low carbon. But also, I think that what's important is not necessarily the speed, but the approach that we take in terms of the transition. It has to be inclusive. Previous changes haven't been, and I think that has created a trust deficit between communities at the coalface of the change and industry, and I think we need to really change that. Second of all, I think government and private sector really need to work together. I say government, we're here to assist private sector with their aspirations, and we assist you with your aspirations through policy and through networking that we can do. And last but not least, I think it's a global change. So really, South Africa has to work with other countries, and other countries should work with South Africa as we work towards the hydrogen economy.
Yeah, so in my last remarks, I would like everyone to leave with the fact that hydrogen must be viewed as an enabler of renewable energy. It unlocks it. So essentially, using hydrogen, you can distribute renewable energy, you convert it to other fuels, you can export it. There's these major opportunities, but as it stands, just the production side or the renewable energy production or the use cases, they cannot work as single entities. They need to work together. They need to come together so the supply and then the offtake is in parallel with each other, and they can exist and have that synergy. So when the suppliers are ready, the off-takers are ready to take on the hydrogen. Beyond doing that, it would be difficult to develop and deploy systems without companies or entities looking to decarbonize either like they're doing at Anglo or through their mining trucks, but decarbonize their production cycles or decarbonizing their operations. Without that support and looking beyond just the cost figures, it is difficult to reduce costs by implementing these systems until the point that they're actually cost competitive.
It's been really exciting to bear witness over the course of this week to the enthusiasm that we've seen from literally thousands of delegates talking about green hydrogen, its potential, not just for South Africa, but for those other African nations that we've heard, like Namibia, like countries in the Horn of Africa, like North Africa, where Morocco and Egypt are progressing at quite some pace now with their plans and attracting projects, and capital. Capital we discussed briefly, but perhaps not in as sufficient detail. How much available capital is there, in particular from the development finance community? Because I know, let me say, I think that what happened last week with the launch of your haulage truck is so symbolic of what I hope will be an acceleration of this industry and this important energy vector over the course of the next months and years. You've captured our imaginations in the way that no amount of academics or, I'm sorry to say, documents or roadmaps was able to do. And you got your president to smile broadly when he was sitting on that truck for the photo opportunity last week. I think we all feel a great sense of enthusiasm and energy and a desire to play our part in catalyzing this, what is let us be in no doubt, what is a phenomenal opportunity for Africa. So I started this morning talking about the IPCC, or this afternoon, with an introduction to the headlines of the IPCC report, which are devastating, and devastating for humanity unless we do something about it. But we end, I hope, on a note of great opportunity and enthusiasm about the solutions that are there. The future is here. The future is now. It's a question of developing at scale and making it accessible in just the same way that Rebecca spoke about, so that it really does enable not just a just transition, but an inclusive transition. I think the figures that were just referenced today are remarkable. 3 million jobs, and all of the externalities and indirect contributions and implications for value chain development in the way that you referred to, Jason. I think it is a once-in-a-generation opportunity in many respects for these nations who have competitive advantage, the opportunity to export to other regions of the world that do not have those advantages and cannot decarbonize without African green hydrogen. For us to develop competitive industries and finally transform this continent into a natural capital superpower. And I see that future, and I think it's realizable, and not least thanks to the contributions of some of these people on our panel here today. So thank you all for joining us today. On behalf of Weber Wenzel and Africa Practice, it's been a real pleasure to have so many of you in the audience today physically with us. We haven't been here for a year, so it's nice to see old friends and faces again. And thank you to all of those who joined us online and waited so patiently for us to kick off this session. I hope it was worth the wait. Thank you, Famida. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Jasons.